Hello. Today I'm looking at a wine that I'm hoping is going to be something of a treat. This is a Pomerol. It's from the 2005 vintage, so an excellent vintage. And this is Petit Village. So I'm looking at a mature wine from an excellent vintage. And yet I'm not completely sure what I'm going to encounter, because for many years, particularly prior to the 2005 vintage, Petit Village was seen as something of an underperforming property. Its vintages were inconsistent, somewhat hit and miss. And this is despite the fact that Petit Village comes from some of the very best terroir in Pomerol. Some of its neighbours are the top chateau of that appellation. And also, in terms of its production, many of Bordeaux's top names have been involved in this chateau. So superficially, the somewhat hit and miss nature of the wines of Petit Village can be a little difficult to understand. Now, the estate has a history dating back to at least 1785, and it's known that in 1799, following the French Revolution, the Dufresne family, a family from Libourne, purchased this estate. At one stage, the estate was owned by the Seguin family, who also owned the highly respected Emilion estate, Clos Fourtet. Now, in 1919, the estate was purchased by Fernand Ginestet. He was a very well-known negociant, and at that stage, the Ginestet family owned Chateau Margaux. 2 years previously, he'd also bought Costes-Tournelle. So they had some very famous chateaux on the Médoc, on Bordeaux's left bank. Now, following the infamous frost of 1956, the entire of Petit Village's vineyards needed replanting, and this could be where some of the problems really started. It could have been because the Ginestet family had most of their experience on the left bank, or it could possibly be a shortage of planting material. But what they chose to do was to plant an unusually high proportion of Cabernet Sauvignon in the vineyards. Their plantings were in excess of 50%, and that made this the vineyard on the right bank with the highest proportion of Cabernet Sauvignon of any estate. In hindsight, this could have been a mistake. Now, financially, the Ginestets fell on hard times in the late 60s and early 70s. And in 1970, they were forced to sell Petit Village, and it was purchased by somebody called Bruno Pratts. And Bruno Pratts also bought Costes-Tournelle from them, taking control of Petit Village in 1971. And one of Bruno Pratts' first decisions was to pull out a lot of the Cabernet and restore the balance much more towards Merlot. Once he'd done this in 1977, he completely renewed the cellars as well. However, in 1989, Bruno Pratts gave up control of Petit Village, selling it to the French insurance company AXA, or AXA, whose subsidiary, AXA Millesimes, already owned Chateau Petit Baron, the second growth in Pauillac, and Chateau Sudereau in Sauternes. AXA have also built up holdings including Disznókő in Tokaj in Hungary, and the port producer Quinta de Noval in the Douro Valley. At that stage, Michel Cazes, the owner of Lynch-Barge, was managing AXA's properties for them because he'd initially to work alongside them to help them when they purchased Chateau Pichon-Longueville Baron. Jean-Michel Cazes stepped aside from that role in 2000 when Christian Seely took over as managing director of AXA Millesimes. Now, under both Cazes and Seely, AXA instigated many improvements at Petit Village. They tried reducing yields. They tried grubbing up some of the vine material they thought was substandard. There were some clones planted that they didn't approve of. In 1996, they adopted a second wine, Le Jardin de Petit Village. They installed new vats. They built a new barrel cellar. And as part of those renovations, Chateau Petit Village now looks like one of the most modern chateaux anywhere in the Pomerol appellation. AXA also brought in leading wine consultant Michel Rolland at around the time of the 1996 harvest. Then in 2005, at the time that this wine was made, Stephane Derenoncourt took over from Michel Rolland in the wine consultant capacity for this estate. Now, subsequent to this wine being made, in 2002, Chateau Petit Village was purchased by the Moulin family, and the Moulin family owned the neighbouring Chateau Beauregard. So the vineyard here at Petit Village is 10.5 hectares in size, and it sits on the Plateau Argileux. And this is a plateau that is about 900 metres across, and it's about 40 metres above sea level. It's a circular area where the soils are mostly clay. They have a stony, gravelly subsoil And the soils contain a massive amount of iron oxide. Many of the best chateaux of Pomerol sit on this one plateau. This is situated just outside the village Catasseau, with view Chateau Certain and Certain-de-May just to the north, Chateau La Consciente to the south, and then to the east is Chateau Beauregard. Now, Petit Village's vineyard is a single block, it's triangular in shape, and the terroir comprises deep gravel with sand, chalk and clay, along with this rich red iron oxide. Merlot is now the predominant grape variety here. Plantings, as I understand it, are about 75% Merlot, with 18% of Cabernet Franc and 7% of Cabernet Sauvignon. And that still leaves Petit Village with one of the highest proportions of Cabernet Sauvignon of any vineyard in Pomerol. I should say at the moment there's further replanting going on, so I guess that balance could change. Now, one of the issues I think here has been that with the various changes going on, it's taken Petit Village a long time to regain the density of mature vines that it's needed. Average vine age is now 35 years, and obviously within that average there are older plots. The vines are now predominantly fully mature, and that does give an additional concentration to the fruit through yield reduction, and because the vines have deeper root systems, it enables more consistency between vintages, because the water supply to the plant is better than is the case for an immature vine without a fully developed root system. Now, 2005 was an excellent vintage throughout Bordeaux. It started well when the beginning of the growing season was warm and dry, ensuring that budburst and flowering went through smoothly. Conditions were exceedingly dry and drought threatened, but thankfully conditions never got so hot that the vines closed down and stopped ripening the fruit. They were always active. Unfortunately, some much needed rains always seemed to fall at just about the right time for the plant, with rains coming to both Bordeaux's left and right bank in August, and then further light rains in September. These rains, however, were followed by warm, sunny days, and there were cool, refreshing nights that were critical to maintain the acidity and delicate aromatics in the grapes. Harvest was fantastic. The fruit was brought in completely clean without any disease pressure. The resulting grapes were small, they were dense, they were concentrated, and Pomerol was able to produce some powerful, concentrated tannic wines. But with well-ripened tannins, there's a good balance between alcohols which didn't get too high, acidity which kept the wines fresh, and the plush, opulent fruit, which gave the wines the ability to age without making them particularly harsh and dry. Just briefly, the winemaking here, picking done by hand. These days specifically, the grapes are vinified plot by plot. I don't know if that was the case in 2005. Fermentation takes place in thermoregulated concrete tanks, and the wines are put into barrel to do their malolactic conversion there. Now, the oak use here are predominantly new French oak barriques, 225 litre barrels, with about 60% being new each year, and the remaining 40% only having been used for one vintage prior. I've seen one or two differing suggestions, but the blend here appears to be somewhere in the region at least of 75% of Merlot, with 20% of Cabernet Sauvignon and 5% of Cabernet Franc. So let's have a look at the wine, shall we? Looking at its colour, it's not particularly deep. It's a dark ruby. There is a sort of an oranging at the rim there. I can see through it fairly easily. Swirling it, the wine has 13% alcohol, which I think these days we don't think is particularly high for a Pomerol. It's clinging fairly readily to the glass and is now starting to form some fairly obvious tears there. So I think that's also the tannin content, the density of the wine, as well as just the alcohol doing that. So let's see what we make of the aromas, shall we? You can smell warmth instantly. There's almost a sort of a rich prune note, plummy notes, but there's plenty of tertiary development. There are dusty notes that are often quite typical of red Bordeaux. There are notes of tobacco leaf. But then there's also quite a rich red fruit, sort of dark red cherry, almost verging on black cherry. Slightly sweetish aroma. I'm not sure aromas can really be sweet, but ripe perhaps is a better way of putting it. And there are also, alongside those dusty notes, some cedary hints. So let's have a taste. That's a fully developed wine. There's a lovely smoothness across the palate, very velvety in texture. Not particularly drying. There are those high ripeness notes. I mentioned prunes. I would say notes of raisin, perhaps, sultana. Moving on almost to a sort of a licoricey richness at one point, then heading on into more dusty notes and a hint of cedar. The acidity is giving some lovely life to the finish. And there at the finish, I'm seeing some almost sort of lifted floral notes, sort of like rose petals, which is a feature I quite often find in older Bordeaux. But I think I actually associate those sort of aromas with wines slightly older than this normally. In terms of weight, this is not a huge, big, rich wine. It has breadth and it has opulence, but its freshness is keeping the fruit in check and stopping it from being a blockbuster. The 13% alcohol really isn't intruding at all. It's perhaps just peaking up the cedary notes. Perhaps I'm just sort of starting to see some little hints of nutmeg and cinnamon there, but those really just are sort of very delicate notes on the finish. The fresh acidity, I guess, combined with those really fine tannins, is leaving a mouth-watering sensation that's giving this lovely long finish. There's a smooth, almost chocolatey texture at the end of the wine. Now, the notes that I've seen suggest that this is a wine that's probably been drinking for the last 15 years and suggest that it should continue to be drinkable up to 2038. Now, I don't know that I necessarily agree with that longevity. Not because I don't think the wine will make it that far. It has concentration, it has good acidity, but it's so lovely now. I think there is perhaps a danger that if you leave it for another 13 years, it might dry out. I think you'd probably get the best results for drinking this from now for the next 4 or 5 years. I don't think you'd gain a lot from leaving it that little bit extra. I'm a little surprised to see the wine only has a WineSearcher aggregated critic score of 90 out of 100. Possibly that hints back to a time when critics were a little less enthusiastic with their scoring. At the same time, I think it's very difficult when you taste a young wine to account for whether it will develop quite as spectacularly as this as it ages. The way it's tasting at the moment, I think this is a lovely wine, and I think I would score it 92 out of 100. And I think I'm very lucky to be tasting it. So thank you so much for joining me. I do hope the tasting has been of interest. If you've enjoyed it, I'd be very grateful if you'd press the like button. If you've been watching these tastings and you haven't subscribed, it would be fantastic if you consider subscribing. That would really help me to develop the channel further. If you have any comments, please leave those in the comments box below. I'd love to know what you think about the wines I'm looking at, the tastings I'm doing, or anything else that relates to that. And if you have friends you think might like to watch it, I'd be very grateful if you'd pass it on to them. I'd really appreciate your endorsement in that way. I'll leave a link in the notes below to the WineSearcher webpage so you can find out where this wine's available and at what price. So hopefully that's a help for you. And it just leaves me to say thank you once again for joining me. And I do hope that maybe you'll manage to make some time and come and join me in the very near future for another tasting. Until then, bye for now.